Good morning. I'm Alain Antil, Director of the Ifri Sub-Saharan Africa Center. We're delighted to welcome you today to our webinar, Doing Politics in African Cities, Actor, Cause, and Form of Urban Social Mobilization. This webinar is part of our Governing Urban Transition in Africa program, which for the past 3 years has been studying how urban expansion in African megacities are planned, and also how certain areas like land mobility and large infrastructure are managed by municipalities, local governments, and the various national and international stakeholders involved. By 2050, most countries in the region will have achieved their urban transition, meaning that over 50 or 60% of their population will live in urban areas. The evolution of this urban growth is often present like a cornerstone of the continent's socio-economic development. Beyond their economic interest, African cities, like other cities around the world, are laboratories for social transformation and major political arenas. Before turning the floor over to the participants, I would like to remind you that you can find all the work of the Governing Urban Transition in Africa program on our website, as well as the work of the Sub-Saharan Africa Center. Several hundred online publications are waiting for you. After the presentation, you will be able to ask a question to the speakers via the chat. I would particularly like to thank Sina Schlimmer and Liz Lessing for designing and organizing this webinar. I now like to give the floor to my colleague Liz Lessing, who will introduce the session and present the speakers. Liz, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Alain. So I'm going to introduce the conference and after our panelists. So from Maputo to Nairobi, Lagos to Dakar, recently, African cities have been the scene of mobilizations by groups of young protesters. Through various causes that are essential to distinguish, common dynamics are emerging. Firstly, cities are growing rapidly, and by 2050, a third of the continent's population will reside in urban areas. Secondly, their populations are increasingly young, with individual age between 18 and 35 currently accounting for 65% of the African population. This unplanned and poorly regulated urbanization, combined with environmental issues and risks affecting coastal cities and informal settlement, exacerbates inequalities. These various factors are prompting young people to mobilize and demand revised public policies. This webinar assesses the actors, causes, and forms of social mobilizations in the cities of Mozambique, Ghana, and Nigeria. It will focus on a particular intersection between urbanization, demographic trends, and politics in Africa. Why, how, and when do urban youth mobilize and participate in political processes? And what do these mobilizations and the responses of public authorities tell us about political and social transformation in Africa in general? To discuss this topic today, I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers. So we have first Dercio Tsandzana, a doctor in political science and a lecturer at the Eduardo Mundlane University in Maputo. Since 2013, he has been actively engaged in research on youth, internet, social networks, and political participation in Mozambique, including online activism for national and international organizations. In addition to his PhD, Dercio has conducted research on digital risk and digital rights and personal data protection with organizations such as Freedom House, Meta, and Facebook. His most recent book, Digital Citizenship, was published in 2023. Our second panelist is Joël Ansah. Joël is a doctoral candidate in political science at Sciences Po, affiliated with the Center for International Research. His research project investigates the intersection of urban informality, urban politics, grassroots social movements, and policy change in cities of the Global South. Especially, his thesis compares Accra and Lagos to examine how residents in urban informal settlements organize themselves through protests, advocacy, negotiation, and litigation to contest and reshape repressive state-led environmental projects. Finally, we are delighted to have Lena Gutheil with us to lead the discussion. Lena is a senior researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. In her current role, she is part of the research and policy advisory project Megatrend Africa, which analyzes the implications of megatrends such as urbanization for the African continent. Her research revolves around question of urban governance in Africa and the role of civil society organizations as political actors. Lena is an anthropologist and development researcher by training. She obtained a PhD at Radboud University in the Netherlands in 2021, studying project management practices among civil society organizations. So thank you all to be here with us today. And I'm going to give the floor to Lena. And we're waiting for one of the panelists. So maybe Joël will start with his presentations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm happy to be here today to present my research, and I'm going to try and share my slides now. Great. Yeah, so good morning once again, and I'm happy to be here at Ifri today to share a bit about my research, which is titled The Settlements of Contestation, Grassroots Comparative Exploration, an exploration of grassroots contentions and mobilizations in flood-prone cities along the Gulf of Guinea. So it is evident from existing literature and from what we know that urban coastal areas, especially those in developing countries, are at the forefront of a lot of climate and environmental risks. And as can be seen on my map, if you look at the west coast of Africa, we have a climate change hotspot. We have cities such as Lagos, such as Cotonou, Lomé, and Accra in this climate change hotspot, which means these areas have multiple climate risks, including flooding, heat waves, sea level rise, and coastal erosion. But also in these urban contexts, it is evident that urban informal settlements are the ones which are most impacted by these environmental and climate risks. And this is due to, one, their exposure naturally to the impacts of climate and other environmental risks. When we look at informal settlements, usually they are located in floodplains and in wetlands, which makes them susceptible to flooding. When you look on the underside, they are also made vulnerable due to the long-term marginalizations, both social, political, as well as economic marginalizations of informal settlements, which deprives them of key basic services as well as adaptive infrastructure to be able to help them cope with environmental and climate change impacts, especially the issue of flooding. From external literature, we've also seen that this vulnerability is further exacerbated by the way that the states or the city authorities try to deal with these flooding issues. Usually, these flood risk reduction efforts are seen to be predominantly technical and top-down, which means they do not necessarily take into account the views and the ideas of the local people, especially those who live in informal settlements. So in the case of Ghana and Nigeria, mostly whenever it floods and the government wants to do something about the flooding situation, they adopt strategies that lead to displacement of people in informal settlements, where they go and demolish their buildings and forcefully evict them from the land. And this is not only specific to the African case, but then if you look at other developing countries in Asia and in South America, this phenomenon is also very much present. So from the literature, we've seen that this strong repression from the state against those who live in informal settlements in the name of environmental projects has led to a lot of tensions and contentions between the city authorities or the governments and those who live in informal settlements. So from literature also, we've seen that these tensions have led to a lot of grassroots movements which engage in protests, which engage in litigations where the local people come together to send the state or the city authorities to court. We've seen instances of riots and violent demonstrations where the people try to oppose the government machinery which tries to evict them. But then also lately we are seeing instances of negotiations and advocacy occurring. But while we know these forms of contestation, there are some key questions that we still need to ask and possibly answer. One is, why do grassroots movements emerge in some contexts and not in others? Usually contexts that have the same phenomena, such as flooding or other environmental risks. Then again, it is important for us to ask how the various movement strategies and action repertoires are employed in different contexts. And lastly, what the implications, the impacts, or the outcomes of these social movements or mobilizations have been on environmental policies in the West African context. So this is the crux of my research, and I've been mainly or predominantly doing my research in Accra, Ghana, and Lagos, Nigeria, comparing two of the biggest informal settlements in these two instances, and trying to understand how these repressive stance of the government has led to various forms of contestation. So I'll briefly talk about the first case, which is Old Fadama in Ghana. Old Fadama is one of the largest and one of the oldest informal settlements in Accra. And as you can see on the map in the yellow, it borders two river bodies. One is the River Odor, and the second one is the Koli Lagoon. So due to the proximity of these informal settlements to the water bodies, it makes it susceptible to flooding. And whenever it rains, yearly, the place gets flooded. And a bit also about the development of this informal settlement. It developed or emerged in the late 1980s to the early 1990s, where pockets of informal shacks and buildings started springing up on the vacant land. But then this development was also encouraged by the government or the state, where they relocated a big yam market in the central of Accra to Old Fadama, which quickened the growth of the informal settlements, as well as the relocation of some victims of inter-ethnic wars in the north of Ghana to Old Fadama on a temporary basis. So this temporary view of the settlements made the government neglect them by not providing them with key or basic infrastructure. There are no services in the settlement, no infrastructure, no drains or whatsoever to help them cope with the issue of flooding in a bid to deter more people from coming to the neighborhood. But then obviously this didn't work. So currently Old Fadama is a site of multiple climate risks. And aside from the periodic flooding that occurs, they also suffer from e-waste pollution because it is also the hub of e-waste markets in Accra. Then, as I mentioned, in the 1990s, the government, in a way or in a bid to deal with the flooding, thought about the project called the Koli Lagoon Ecological Restoration Project, which sought to improve the ecological characteristics of the river, in the photo, in order to contain floodwaters whenever it rains. So the first phase was on the restoration works, and the second phase which was to start in 2003, was to beautify the environment and improve basic infrastructure of the land around the river body to prevent flooding. But then this also meant that those who live on the old Fadama land had to be forcefully evicted without any plans of relocation or the payment of compensations. So because of this project, in May 2002, the local government, which is the AMA of Accra, issued an eviction notice to the people on the land to evict the land for the project to happen. But then this is not the only time eviction threats were given to those who live on the land. I think in 2009, when there were issues of flooding, the government's first point of call was to go to this old Fadama settlement and demolish parts of the settlement. Same happened in 2015 after a strong, or should I say a deadly flooding event in Accra, where over 150 people died. The government's first action was to go to this land and demolish part of the shacks and evict the people without giving them any alternative housing. Then also at the peak of the COVID pandemic in 2020, there were also controlled partial evictions in this settlement. So this repressive stance of the government in the name of flood control towards those who live in Old Fadama has led to different forms of local responses, mobilizations, and contestations. Now, the first and the primary form of resistance or contestation that can be seen in this settlement is civil disobedience or the disregard for calls of eviction. So whenever the government goes to issue calls for evictions, either people disregard, or when their buildings are demolished, they hang around for a couple of days and then build back their shacks in defiance of the state's orders. Now, these forms of contestations are what we call atomized and organized. These are not collective forms of contestation, but then these are individual forms of resisting the government's attempts to push them off the land. But then, on the flip side, we have more organized and more coherent forms of social mobilization and grassroots movements, which emerged in the case of Old Fadama in 2002, when the local government issued the first eviction threat. So when this threat was issued, we saw international NGOs such as SDI, which is the Slum Dwellers International, coming to the settlement and helping to form different NGOs such as the PD, which we will talk about soon, and also some local community organizations like the Ghana Federation for the Urban Poor and the Old Fadama Development Association. Now, the idea behind the formation of these local associations is to find a way to bring all these people together, all these people who were trying to resist on their own, to bring them together into a group, coordinate their activities, and teach them ways or enlighten them on ways to engage the state. So the first action that they took after forming these associations was litigation. So in 2002, led by one of the civil service organizations called, civil society organizations called CEPIL, they went to court to protest or to resist the government's attempt to evict them from the land. Now, this litigation, the outcome of the courts was against the residents, but then also it gave, the court ruled that before the government could evict them, then the government has to find a way to relocate them to a different place, which the government has not been able to do. So the settlement is now still in place. But aside from litigation, we've seen instances of violent demonstrations, which happened in 2009 after the partial demolitions, as well as in 2015, and some of which are were also influenced by partisan politics, because in 2015, that was the eve of election year. So we had a lot of electoral agitations, which also led to the wholesale mobilization of those who live in the settlements to riots. Then, after 2015, we are seeing more subtle ways of resistance and contestation, which involve negotiations between the residents and the local governments, with the NGO serving as liaisons, and also attempts at collaboration. So especially in 2020, as I mentioned about the controlled demolitions, this was controlled because it was done in conjunction with the local people. And then they chose which of the shacks in the settlement to demolish. So these are the key actors, as I mentioned, Slum Dwellers International, which is an international organization which works in different cities to help those to help protect the rights of those who live in informal settlements. Then we have People's Dialogue, which is a local NGO which plays a liaison role between international organizations such as SDI and the UN Habitat with the local people. And then we have community organizations such as the GAFOP and the Old Fadama Development Association. Now, quickly to the case of Badia East, which is the second case that I study. Just like Old Fadama, Badia East was one of the biggest informal settlements in Lagos, and it was identified, and in the map, it's the one in the red, so you could see it's close to the Lagos Harbor and the Komodo Channel in Lagos, which makes the place very swampy. So it was identified in 2007 by the World Bank to benefit from the Lagos Metropolitan Development and Management Project, which was to improve the living conditions of these slums or informal settlements, and also give them key adaptive infrastructure to be able to deal with the issue of flooding. So in the case of Badia East, they were earmarked to benefit from the construction of a canal. And this is a picture from the place. And as you can see, I mentioned that it's a swampy place because it is close to the Lagos Harbor. And one way the residents try to deal with the issue of flooding and the swampy nature of the land is to fill the land with waste, to have places to walk, and also to have solid ground to walk on. So, as I mentioned, the LMDGP project was sponsored by the World Bank to improve the living conditions and then also help the people deal with flooding. But then, just like we saw in the case of Old Fadama, the LMDGP project, for it to be implemented, there had to be the displacement of over 10,000 residents in Badia East without relocation or the payment of compensations, because the local government said they were living on the land illegally and thus were not entitled to any forms of compensations or relocation. And these displacements of 10,000 residents caused massive social and economic disruptions of the people who live there and led the emergence of grassroots mobilizations that's similar to what we saw in the case of Old Fadama in Ghana. So this is just a little map to show the change in land use in Badia East. In 2011, we could see the land use before the implementation of the LMDGP project. And already in 2012, we could see portions of the settlement eroded or displaced. Then in 2013, more of the settlement was displaced. And then in subsequent years, more demolitions occurred for different other reasons and not necessarily just the LMDGP. And this is Badia East today and how they deal with the issue of flooding and other stuff. But then, similar to what happened in Old Fadama as well, these displacements led to different forms of mobilizations and contestations. The first one also being an atomized and individual basis, where people linger around after their structures have been demolished to put them back after a couple of days or weeks. Then, similarly, we have movement organizations and NGOs who are key actors in these settlements to bring the people together, to teach them about their rights and how the government is infringing on their rights by evicting them without compensations or relocations. And in the case of Badia East, we've seen different forms of mobilizations. One is through protests. Then we see litigation as the Center, Social and Economic Rights Action Center, CERI, led the community to court, although they lost the court case. And then we have media campaigns and documentaries where the people themselves come together and document through videography the impact of these actions of the government on their lives and how the demolitions have affected their lives. And this is to project their narrative and counter the narrative of the government. Then we also have advocacy, which was done locally to the Lagos state government. But then key is the international advocacy, where they sent a team to protest to the World Bank in Washington, DC, to halt the payment of funds to the project until a resettlement action plan was made. And also they also employ violent demonstrations and riots, especially during the times that the evictions are actively taking place. Eventually, through their mobilizations, they were able to get the World Bank to force the Lagos state government to pay to pay compensations to them, the affected residents. But then, as at last year, when I was talking to some of the residents still on the land, they told me that these compensations were either too small to rent in other parts of Lagos, or some of them didn't receive the compensations at all. So to conclude, through this comparison, we can see some key things to learn. One of them being the importance of different arenas of contestation and the use of different methods. So as we saw in the case of Old Fadama, they have the local arena of contestation where they try to engage the local government to advocate, to negotiate with them and advocate for the rights of the people, as well as to demonstrate to them. But then on the flip side, they also try to maintain international relationships with organizations such as SGI, as well as the UN Habitat, to give them that international legitimacy and to also add another layer of pressure on the government to find a happy medium. So aside from this, we also learned the key role of existing strong community ties. In the case of Old Fadama, from 2002, when these organizations were set up, it engendered a very strong community tie among the people since they meet periodically. And this vibrant community organization, coupled with a strong coordination between the different NGOs that are working in the settlement, they were able to win strong concessions from the government. And now the government is no longer bent on evicting them, but rather the government is more open to dialoguing with them and collaborating with them. Compared to Badia East, where there is no strong community ties, and even the presence of the NGOs are key, but then these NGOs don't work in coordination. So we have siloed activities by different NGOs, which has undermined their ability to exist as a community. So although they won some concessions from the World Bank, where they got some compensations, today a huge chunk of the settlement is no longer existent. And then lastly, a key thing that's okay, the third one is the simultaneous use of different strategies and how this enhances the likelihood of favorable outcomes. So these local NGOs and the organizations do not just stick to one action repertoire, say litigation or only protest, but then they blend all these things simultaneously, seeking to expand the various arenas at which they can contest and also enhance their chances of gaining positive or favorable outcomes. Lastly, an emerging trend is the use of the media. In the case of Old Fadama in Ghana, the associations focus so much on the traditional media, where they engage the radio stations and the TV stations to preach their case and counter the negative narratives that usually come from the government. But then in the case of Badia East in Lagos, we are seeing key NGOs using social media to propagate their case, as well as the production of interesting documentaries and films that portray the case of the people and also preach their message to the entire world, both locally and internationally. And a key example of one of these films is The Legend of the Vagabond of Lagos, which was a film brought together by the key NGOs that work in informal settlements to show the impacts of these evictions on the lives of the people and how they've been trying to resist these. And this is a very interesting film that has filmed in Canada and other countries in the global north to gain this international legitimacy. So I'll bring my discussion to an end now, and thank you for your attention as well.
Thank you so much, Joël. I'm going to give the floor to Dercio now. You can share your screen also.
Okay, thank you. I hope that you can hear me very well.
Yes, perfect.
Yes, thank you. Before we start the call, I just went down with my internet, so I hope that now it can work very well, and I can go until the end, listen very well to my colleague Joel. So it was great. I hope that you can also hear me very well, and I will share my presentation now. And so here we go. So thank you again for inviting me to join this morning or this afternoon for some of you. And I'm based in Maputo, and I will be discussing with you some topics that are part of my research. on youth, internet, and urban social mobilization. And this work I've been doing not only related to Mozambique, but the last year we've been trying to do some kind of comparing studies just to understand in some Lusophone countries like Angola, like Cape Verde, how things are going related to the youth. But before we start, I would like just to highlight some points that are part of this webinar. I just went to the description that you have sent to us, and I found some data that for me is important to understand why are we discussing it today and how can we relate to the topic with the youth in plural, and then I will explain why I prefer to call youth in plural and not only in singular. The first point is about some kind of data that we can agree or not, but it's dependent on which point we want to discuss the topic. But there are general consensus to say that in Africa, the cities are growing. And by 2015, probably our continent, I'm saying because I'm based in Mozambique now in Africa, we will see people living in urban areas. So this kind of emergence of people going from rural to urban areas are putting much pressure in urban service like health, education, transport, and other kind of public service. The second point is about the majority of people that are living in these areas. They are between 18 to 35. We can discuss what does it mean? Is it about youth or not? How to define youth? Is about age, or is about social inclusion? It's about political participation, but then we will come for that point later. And the other point is these people that are coming from some regions going down, for example, in the case of Mozambique, going down because Maputo is in down city in the south of Mozambique, they go there and then they don't find conditions to live. For example, housing, public education, health, and transport. So these four topics are what most of the main topics that I've been discussing in countries like Mozambique in the last year, because we have a lot of people coming from province in the center and the north. They go down to the south and then they don't find solutions from their life. So it led people to protest and also to demand for public service because they want a reply, they want some kind of answer from the public governments because they're there also. They feel that sometimes no one is there to reply or no one is there to care on what they're asking for. But before we go straight to our main topic, I would like to bring for your attention some kind of tensions that we found when we discuss about youth. Why do we call youth in plural and not youth in singular? There are different perceptions on why do we define youth not as a unique category, but also we base it on the society where they live. I've been for a long time in France and doing my master and PhD. But the way you define youth in France will not be the same that how I define young people in the case of Mozambique, for example. But there are some kind of aspects that we can find as a common. For example, the age, the gender, the social class, and the way that society define the youth. We can say, for example, that some people consider that they are still young because they still live with their parents. They don't have their personal house. They don't have a family like children, and also they didn't get married. So they still think that they're young people because they're still in the move of becoming adults. Or this kind of explanation maybe can work in France, or maybe it can work in Mozambique, but there are different perceptions on how to define young people. The other aspect is about social class. We can't have the same kind of perception on what do you consider social class, for example, in Portugal or Nigeria or in the case of Mozambique. So the way you understand it, it will depend on where are you based now and how the society define also young people. For example, we consider, according to someone who has been my supervisor in France, Tiberi, he used to say that it's not only about age, it's also about the way or the transition between childhood to adulthood. So this kind of transition between one age to another can also help us to define young people. The other aspect is about culture and institutions. As I said, for example, the way I see the parliament in Mozambique is not the same way that you see your parliament. The way you protest is not the same way that young people in the case of Mozambique, they protest. So we have the age as the first topic. Then we can have the status of student, employed, working or not. Then we can also consider the social role. These people, they're still dependent of their parents, yes or no. And the other aspect is about how the politicians see young people. For example, we used to say in Mozambique that young people, they have been seen as a good people for elections because we need them to mobilize people. We need, or they need politicians, they need young people to mobilize for elections. They need young people to do the campaigns, but then they forget these people after the elections. So we have this kind of youth as seen as a hope and as a threat. For example, we see hope because they're important for elections, but then when they win, these young people are not there, and so they are forgotten by politicians. The other aspect is about the period of marginalization and also as a future. For example, in Mozambique, some people say that young people, they are not the future, they're the present, because they want to be part of the change now and not in the future. And this is part of the debate between the president, for example, nominating someone with the ages under, let's say, 82 years old. So how we still nominate these people for the cabinet, for the executive of the country, because the country is made up by more than 60% of people in Mozambique, they're young, or they are considered as a young. We can discuss what does it mean, 18 to 35. So the majority of people in the case of Mozambique, are young people. So how do you still nominate people 82, 80, 75 years old to be part of the cabinet? So all of these tensions, all of these aspects make that people or young people, they need change and they advocate for something. And Alcinda Homwana, she's an anthropologist. She's been discussing a lot on what does it mean for the urban areas to have the majority of people that live there, but they don't have conditions. The first point that Alcinda Homwana gives in our perception is about growing inequalities, because these people are living in areas where the power also live there. And the power, I mean, executive, the president, the ministers, and they can see that there are differences between me and you, or them and myself. And this makes people think that there are inequalities between me and you. And the other aspect is about the urban areas. Ideally, it can make people to do protest because it's easy, for example, to do protests in urban areas, and your voice will be listened by who needs to decide. You can do the protest in urban areas. That's easy to do, but probably the chance that you have to be listened will not be the same when you do the same kind of protest in urban areas. So urban areas, sometimes it leads people to be easily listened to by politicians. And the other aspect that Alcinda Homwana suggests for our discussion is about the power of communication. My colleague Joel also mentioned about that. So the internet gave power for these people to create a new arenas or new areas of doing politics, and I will explain maybe later about that. And also, it creates some kind of using the street to do something. For example, as Castells also, Emmanuel Castells also gives to our understanding, is the information, there's a rapid dissemination of information, the coordination of doing mobilization, it's easy, and also it can help young people to mobilize well. The other aspect about amplification, the voice can amplify easily when you use social media to mobilize, and also you can do some kind of counter narration between dominant narratives from the traditional media, television, radio, and other kinds of media outlets. So I will start with a question. Are young people under pressure in urban areas? Maybe yes and not. And I will try to explain it in my next slides. The first point is about urbanization. I think that my colleague also explained very well about that. So I will not take time explaining this kind of issues. But I would like to bring attention on point number 2, the precarity. Because as I said before, the majority of people that lives in this area, they are considered as young people. But the way that they live, the condition that they have, they can be considered as precarity conditions. And the other aspect is how the society see these people. There is some kind of expectation coming from the society about young people. So when they feel that they're not answering these expectations, they can become frustrated, and for that, it will move them to do some kind of pressure. And here we have some examples that maybe you know very well, because we're here also of colleagues that have been working a lot on Africa. One of them that the most maybe known example is what we call Printemps Arabe, or Arab Spring, for example, and the feast must fall in South Africa, and Yonamar movement in Senegal. And one of the movements that I've been studying is this movement from Maputo, the anti-employment movement that happened in 2010 here in Mozambique, Maputo, the capital of the country. So how is it related to digital tools? Why young people are mobilizing? Here, I'm showing, let's say, a graphics or some kind of table that can show you easily how young people or how Mozambicans are using social media in the country. Facebook is the most used social media platform in Mozambique. And from this platform, we have more than 3 million people connected daily to use Facebook. Maybe you will ask me why Facebook, because in France, I know that X or Twitter is the most used platform, or maybe TikTok or WhatsApp. But in the case of Mozambique, we don't use much X as European people use, for example, but we use mostly Facebook to do mobilization and also to do some kind of protest. And here, I remember that when you invited me, it was in January or maybe last year, to join this webinar. I didn't have this screenshot, but yesterday when I was finalizing, I changed it for my presentation that I sent to you, Liz, because it happened this Monday, and young people went to protest in the front of the new buildings that have been done by the government for young people, because they need housing in Maputo. So I tried to translate it. This is for group to translate, so sorry if it's not well done, but you can see down, peaceful demonstration by young people took place today on Monday in Maputo, specifically in the area of Chiango in the south of Mozambique, that we call it Casa Jovem, is youth housing. So they are protesting because Chinese, they are building a big housing area in Mozambique, but they say that this is not for us, this is for elites. We will not have housing there because we are not considered by the power. So this Monday, they went to protest because they need housing and they want us to be part of this change of housing in Maputo. But at the same time that I said online is okay, we also have some negative impacts of using online mobilization for young people. One of them is about censorship. We have been seeing in different countries, including mine in Mozambique, some kind of internet shutdown. At the same time that you can have mobilization online, you also to consider the negative impact of this online mobilization. The other point is about inequality of access, what we call digital divide. At the same time that you can be connected in areas like Maputo, is the capital, the connection is not good when you go outside of the country. So how can we talk about internet mobilization in the country where we still have digital divide? The other point is what we call echo chambers. was like activism. At the same time that you can be connected, use the internet, you still have this way of speaking to yourself or mobilizing only you and your friends. So is it online mobilization? Is only, it's like activism. The other point is how can we measure the impact of online mobilization? Is it possible? Yes or not? But we have someone who trying to answer these questions, who said the internet is not a revolution, but is one tool among them, or is one tool among many. But the internet, according to Morozov, it will not bring us a change, but it can help, for example, for some kind of making your human rights respected. So how do they mobilize? They use digital technology in the case of Mozambique to get mobilized. They use what we call informal political participation. They don't go to vote. They can consider doing campaigns, but the way that mobilize, it can change. And the other way, I think that Joel also spoke about that, is using art as activism. The way that you mobilize also can be part of art as a way. And here I will give you an example. And on what we call here in Mozambique, people in power. People in power in Portuguese, if you translate, it will lead you to say, povo no poder. So people in power was a large movement started in 2023 after the death of the guy that you can see painted in the back. His name is Azagaya. Azagaya was a rapper who died in 2023, and people used Azagaya as a way to do politics. Young people took these people in power using social media to mobilize them, because Azagaya was someone who criticized corruption, who criticized inequalities, and also criticized the way that Frelimo is the ruling party in Mozambique, was doing politics. So they took this guy named Azagaya as a rapper, and they use his lyrics and also his music to do some kind of giving voice for people, because they felt like frustrated regarding to the way that the power is done. But in the recent weeks in Mozambique, I think that you've been following, and I know that Sina has been also following some kind of topics in Mozambique, and we've been seeing some kind of change of the way that people are mobilized. For example, during the last elections that were held in October 2024, young people, they engaged in elections, because we used to say that they don't like elections, they don't vote because they don't want to engage with formal politics. But something is happening in Mozambique, because they started for elections to do some kind of protest. And the way that they mobilized was not going on TV to do mobilization, was not going on or using newspaper to mobilize. So they started using social media, mainly Facebook, to mobilize. But again, internet was shut down in Mozambique for more than 3 weeks, but they found some kind of solutions to do it. So how young people are voting in Mozambique, as you can see, they still trust in elections. For example, maybe it's not the same in France. I can see some kind of debates in the last weeks or months, but in the case of Mozambique, you can see that people, they still trust elections. The point is not about elections, it's about who is leading the country, because we've been for more than 50 years now with the same party. So some kind of data can show us that, okay, Mozambicans, they still believe that they can vote or they can have a change, but after the election, they see some kind of problems that are not accurate. So I will move maybe to the end, because maybe the time is not on our hand. So what Afrobarometer also will try to show us is probably in Africa, people, they still prefer democracy, because we've been seeing that democracy is in mistrust because of the United States of America, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, and also in Argentina and other countries. But in Africa, Afrobarometer, they show us that people, they still trust democracy as the unique way of doing politics. But they reject at the same time the single party. But in the countries like Mozambique, South Africa, Zimbabwe, you still have ANC, ZANU-PF, and Frelimo, that they're still the same party that gave us the liberation, that are still in power. and they reject, more than 70% reject a single party. And the other points are about military rule. For example, we've been seeing countries like Mali and others in Niger, Burkina Faso, where we had a coup d'etat, and majority of Africans, they reject this kind of leading the countries. And finally, we can see that more than half of Africans, they are prepared to accept the military coup. For example, how is it possible to see that at the same time that they consider democracy as the good way, why they can say that we accept to have only one leader? So I will finalize my presentation not with conclusion, but maybe with some questions. The question number one is, what space remain open for genuine political participation by young people in Yoruba Africa? Is there a genuine space to do politics for young people in Africa? This is the first question. The second question will be, how can the authorities respond or address mobilization without repression? Is it possible in our continent, in Africa today, to respond to that without repression? The other question is the internet transforming the way that we do or young people mobilize, or is the same way but using different tools? And the final question will be, under what conditions can this mobilization lead to real social change? Is the internet changing the landscape, or we still face the same way of doing politics in Africa? And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dercio. I'm going to give the floor to Lena.
Thank you, Lise, and thanks to Ifri for inviting me. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks also so much for the very interesting presentations, Dercio and Joel. I think you've already mentioned a really large variety of issues, so we have a lot of things to discuss. And I was asked to give a comment, and I will just kick off, by picking up on some of the things that you guys have mentioned, and also pose some questions so that we can have a first round of Q&A. But I would like to encourage everyone who is listening to already write their questions in the chat while we do that very first round, so that we can transition smoothly to the second round where we can read the questions that you pose in the chat. And hopefully we'll have enough time to answer all of the very pressing issues. And yeah, Joel, very fascinating. I think you already touched upon a lot of issues that I also think are very pertinent when we talk about these broader trends of, what urbanization and demographic change, as in growing youth populations, basically mean for politics on the continent. And I think if we go to policy circles, we often have these very bipolar narratives. And you already mentioning it with regard to domestic policies. Youth are either presented as a threat or a hope for societies. But I think even if we look at the bigger discourse at the macro level, we often find that especially urban youth are often presented as either being violent, unemployed youth, as troublemakers, very negatively, or they're presented as harbingers of democracy and programmatic politics because they're enlightened. And we know also from Afrobarometer research and demographic research that urbanites tend to be better educated and also wealthier if we look at the average numbers. And that's why I like these two presentations a lot, because I think these very big narratives are basically hiding the complexity that we see on the ground. And of course, if we look at the average numbers, we can say urbanites are maybe better educated or wealthier. But urban areas, I think, have a very large disparity of populations. We've seen informal settlements in the presentation of Joel, but there are, of course, middle class and wealthy individuals also residing in cities. So that is maybe, the first issue that I want to highlight. And Joel, you already introduced us to the academic discourse about youths in the plural. So young people are not a homogeneous group. So maybe I can play that ball back to you. asking who exactly are these people that you deal with in your research? And in the case of Joelle, we know that you worked in informal settlements, but is it actually only youth who protest, or are they in alliance maybe with other groups? What kind of particular role do young people actually play in the mobilizations you observe? And maybe also for the case of Mozambique, we might have some more time for Dercio also to go into the more recent mobilizations and protest actions that we've seen last year around the elections. Who is actually protesting in urban areas? Is it only young people? What do we know about that? I think sometimes it's a kind of black box also, because it's hard to research if we have mass mobilizations on the street. And also, if we compare urban and rural protests, maybe you know something about that in your own country contexts, because I think there is, generally speaking, a lot of research about urban areas, and you've already mentioned it. Protests in urban areas seem to be more effective just because of the political significance of especially capital cities. But sometimes we might also underestimate the power of rural protests, and they might simply not be as mediatized, and we might underestimate the prevalence of rural protests. But if we go back to the other line of thinking, this narrative of young people as troublemakers, and Joelle, you also touched upon this issue about sort of protest tactics and how do young people actually participate politically speaking. And we know from research that young people vote much less than older people. And that's not only true for the African continent, that is true, I think, worldwide. But we also see in Afrobarometer data that young people, for instance, do not join community groups as often, and they're also not members of political parties. But on the other hand side, they are slightly more prone to take part in protests. So we see that shift towards more informal type of political mobilization. So this is maybe another area of inquiry, the fluidity of forms of political participation. And I think you've mentioned already quite a number of different tactics. In the Mozambican case, even art, singing, dancing. In Joelle's case, we've heard about litigation, advocacy. So protest is just one tactic of making your voice heard. So that is another thing that I wanted to ask you. What do you think makes a specific tactic successful, or is it maybe the combination? So how would you situate protest actually in this big pool of tactics that people use? And related to that, a research area of mine is also civil society, and I was quite intrigued by how Joelle was describing how international NGOs, even the World Bank, was in collaboration with more informal groups, how they lobbied the government. But what we know from civil society research is that especially professional organizations who are donor funded are often not the ones who are politically, or cause political transformation, because they're working on their projects and they're less agile. So from your experience, how would you say could maybe also Western donors support the more political side of things? I think, and we talk, I'm working at a research institute that is also doing policy advice, and I hear that from policymakers a lot. How can we actually support social movements? But then if I talk to people on the ground, they're often quite reluctant, saying, we don't want to be accused of working with a foreign government. We don't want to get in the hassle of the administrative side of things. It takes away the flexibility. So what would be your take on that question? And then my very last point is temporality. And you also already touched upon that. At what point in time do protests actually occur? Joelle mentioned election times and an urban crisis. And my own research revolves around Kenya. And in Kenya, we've also seen protests, especially last year, the famous Gen Z protests. But what we've seen that over time, and especially in response to violent government crackdown, is that protesters have changed their tactics. So while in the beginning it was really the classic forms of protest, now a lot of protest is actually happening online, in the sense of, you know, people monitoring service delivery projects of the government, exposing corruption on social media. So over time, tactics have actually changed and adapted. Is that something that you've also seen in your research context? And especially in the Mozambican case, I'd be interested because the protests are recent, and you've shown us this one image that was, of 2 days ago. So how would you assess that, the nature of protests evolving over time? And I leave it here, and I give the floor back to you. And then after this very first round, we'll go into the questions of the audience. So feel free to pick up on a number of things that you found interesting. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, okay, I could
Yeah.
go first. Yeah. So thank you so much, Lena, for your comments, which are very enlightening, as well as the key interesting questions that you posed, which are to myself a little bit challenging as well. But then I'll try my best to respond to them. So I think the first one is it only the youth who join these protests or these mobilizations in the context that I observe, and what roles do they play? So this is a very interesting question, because in the two contexts that I study, there seemed to be some kind of subtle division of who does what. It was very evident that, especially in the pictures that I saw of the protests and then the narratives, that the young people are more inclined to join demonstrations, to join protests, to join riots, to express their displeasure. But then aside from that, especially in the case of Badia East in Lagos, we also saw young people mainly being the ones who were doing the media campaigns, the documentaries. They were the ones who were sharing their experiences as to what happened to them. Then when it comes to the issue of advocacy, which is also one of the ways that they use the residents of these informal settlements engage the state, we see more elderly people being engaged in this advocacy, the elders in the communities, the opinion leaders, as well as the community association leadership. So this seems to be some form of a subtle division of labor between the different demographics of these informal settlements. And then, yeah, so you also asked about what's specific, or what do I think about the specific tactics, or do I think which specific tactics or action repertoires are more effective in the context that I study in relation to protests? So in the two contexts that I study, which also draws back to the work of Diana Mittling, which says that in most of these informal settlements, or this context, these different tactics, such as litigation, such as protests or demonstrations, such as advocacy, do not happen in silos, but then usually they occur simultaneously. And in my field in Lagos and Accra also, we could see these different forms or tactics playing out simultaneously. And it is my hunch that the simultaneous implementation of these different actions actually improves the chances of the grassroots movement or the residents in securing favorable outcomes. Just as an example, in the case of Badia East, whilst the case was still in court and they were still dialoguing with the state government, they still made their documentaries and sent a delegation to the World Bank, all within the same space. So they're actually fighting their battles on many fronts using different tactics at the same time. And eventually, they had a concession from the World Bank, right? So the thinking is that these different tactics implemented simultaneously actually boosts the chances of the local people to actually gain some concessions. And then also, each of these different tactics have or has their own reasons, because I remember talking to one of the representatives of People's Dialogue, of Justice Empowerment Initiative in Lagos, and then they mentioned that the main reason why they do the documentaries and then the media coverage is to publicize, as well as protests, is to publicize the case, because usually when evictions are happening, the government controls the narratives and usually paints the community as you mentioned, the young people there being unemployed, being violent people, being criminals. So these are the narratives that are usually propagated by the states. But then through the media engagement, through the documentaries, these are used to counter the narratives of the government, and not necessarily as an end in themselves, as in to gain concessions, but then to amplify the voices of the people and also gain international attention to invite more pressure on the government. So I think it's a blend of all these different tactics all happening at the same time, which kind of helps to improve the chances of the movements and then the different organizations in gaining their concessions from the government. And one very important or interesting question you asked is the role that the Western organizations and donor organizations could play to support these social movements. And then one thing I saw in the case of Old Fadama in Accra was how SDI, for instance, which everyone knows that they are so much into these protecting the rights of informal settlements, but then also the UN Habitats that works closely with them, and how these two usually have urban forums where they handpick members from the Old Fadama community to attend these forums and learn more about different ways that they could engage the government. So one key way as an avenue that these international organizations could help support social movement is through capacity building of the local people. And this was very evident in the case of Old Fadama in Accra, when during, at the height of the threat of eviction, a couple of the people were selected by SDI to go to Kenya to learn about community enumeration and census as a way to gather data on the community, to present a fact or to prevent counter narratives to the government to show the actual impacts the evictions would have on the people. Because at the time, the government of Ghana was not taking census in Old Fadama because they were considered to be informal and illegal. But then through the data collection of the community associations, everyone knew the actual number of people who live in Old Fadama, the various businesses that are in Old Fadama, and what the eviction would mean to the over 80,000 people who reside in the settlement. So this was realized through capacity building of the young people in the settlement, which were taken out to learn in Kenya, where there are similar issues. So I think one key way that could be leveraged by international organizations is through capacity building of the activists in this context. I think I'll pass the ball to Dercio now.
Okay, thank you. I will try probably to answer not all of the questions because, as you said, Lena, we are still doing some kind of research, mainly related to the current situation in Mozambique. And I have to be honest here, the situation is still tense. For example, it was this Monday too, we had a situation in the center of Mozambique of people protesting. And probably now the tactics are changing, as you said, because people are not protesting anymore about elections. In October, November, December, and January, it was about elections, but then people expanded the way that they see politics and now discuss about housing, the public security. So they're trying to use the momentum also to do some kind of demands regarding to the public politics in Mozambique. So when you ask me, who are these people protesting in Mozambique or in some areas? Yes, obviously, it's not only people from 18 to 35. It's not only people from 18 to 25. there are people there protesting, for example, for their children or for future of the people that they're carrying on today. There's a video that I didn't put here because of the time, but it's also in Portuguese. Maybe it wasn't good to put in Portuguese here. But for grandmother saying that I'm here because of my children. I'm here because I need a good future for my children. And this video went viral in Mozambique for more than 2 weeks now. As you can see, people are protesting not only because they want a rapid, let's say, a change, but they also think about the future. For the ages are very different. And I'm now working with a Center of Human Rights Organization in Mozambique, trying to understand the profile, but I will not maybe give you the right answer now because we're still working on it. The other point is on urban areas and rural areas. Are we underestimating maybe the comparison between the two areas? I think that yes, you are right saying that, because we can't only consider a urban area or capitals as the main center of doing politics. There are people also there doing politics, but in different ways. For example, what I've been seeing in rural areas in Mozambique is the areas where there are mining activities in rural areas, people are protesting there because they're saying that these mining activities, it doesn't benefit myself. It doesn't give benefits for my community. So please stop doing this here. Stop doing the mining here because you are not benefiting me as a citizen. So this kind of protests are not in Maputo. They happen in rural areas where mining companies like Total, for example, from France, and other companies are doing some kind of mining exploration. People are saying, please don't do that because you are not giving me the benefits here. So this happens in rural areas in Mozambique. The other point is about tactics. I think that is changing, for example, in Mozambique now, and they use the elections at the beginning, but now is more than elections. Elections is only one of the main issues that people are protesting. So there's some kind of informal and formal way of doing politics. But there are one question from you when you talk about Afrobarometer, where people still think, for example, democracy matters. Maybe there's a difference between Africa in general and Europe, for example, because we can see from this data that people, they still believe that democracy is important. But the point is about who is leading the country and not about the system itself, but about who is leading the country. Maybe this is a difference that I would like to highlight. I had a question, I think that Joel also mentioned, so I will not take time on it. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very comprehensive. And yes, indeed, I think there is, of course, a qualitative difference between youth perceptions of democracy in Europe and Africa. And it's often probably also difficult to disentangle if people are per se, theoretically speaking, in like pro-democracy, but then what do they see as democracy happening in their countries in terms of service delivery, or the way institutions function. I mean, if that is labeled democracy, it is oftentimes very disappointing. But yeah, I think the democracy debate is for another day. And thank you also for highlighting how elections can actually be sort of like work as a catalyst for other kinds of protests and demands. I think that's a very interesting finding. And yeah, for the second round, we do have a number of questions in the chat. I'll just read them out for you. The first one by Monsuru Muritala goes to Joel. I would like to know the settlement pattern politics that attended the displacement in Badia, Lagos. The second question by Monsuru is about city protests in East Africa. Well, I think that is a little unfair because none of you does research on East Africa. Maybe we keep that for another discussion. Then Jérôme Koch asks, back to question 3 in Dercio's conclusion, to which extent do you think digital technology actually shapes protest? And more generally, the political debate in Africa, and can it support positive democratic development in an African way? Very good. We bring back the social media dimension. And the very last question by F. Allen concerning Nigerian cities. oh no, he or she is saying that in Nigerian cities, politicians have found a way of sponsorship or to sponsor protests in their interest, in complete opposition to the public interest. How can the genuine civil society tackle this trend? So I believe this is about the politicization of protest movements or capture, basically. So yeah, we have 8 minutes left. Maybe brief last comments of you, and then we can hand back for the wrap up to Alain.
Yes, so maybe I would like to comment on Monsuru and Alain's questions or comments. So I think it's very true that politicians often find their ways, especially which was evident in Ghana, to sponsor some of these protests to compete with the opposition. I think in 2015, as I mentioned, in Old Fadama, there was this major demonstration and riot after the how do we call it, the demolition of part of the settlement. And this was actually engineered by the then opposition NPP, because the ruling NDC was in power, and then the following year was going to be an election. So it was a way to bring people together for the opposition to kind of promote their own agenda. So if you see tons of the photos that were taken, you could see tons of the protesters in the opposition T-shirts with inscriptions against the president. So one could see that although they had a genuine cause to protest because their houses have been demolished, they were also doing the bidding of the major political party, which was using the opportunity to bring people together and gain popularity. And I think one way that these civil society organizations can tackle this trend is to disentangle themselves from these oppositions, because usually when this happens, the true intent of the protests and the demonstrations are lost to political discussions, because everyone on radio or TV who talks about this protest will mention, oh, but then we saw a lot of the opposition political party over there, so these have political causes. But then I think it's important for the movement organizations, the NGOs, and the community movements or associations to distance themselves from these political parties and then actually project their cause, so that the narrative or the partisan political narrative does not actually overshadow the real reason why these protests go on. And then to the other question about settlement party politics that attended the displacements in Badia East, I don't really understand. But then what the question actually was trying to ask. But then I could provide a bit of context on the political landscape in Badia East. Through my interviews, we realized that a couple of the people are still there due to clientelism, in the sense that they have how do we call it, links with the state's government. So whenever there were state elections, the state, those who were in the running would come to the neighborhood and then promise these local people that, okay, if you vote for us and we come to power, we are not going to evict you. I think that happened especially during the tenure of Governor Ambode, when he came and then he promised the people that he was not going to do evictions when voted into power. And then the community organization put their supported him during the elections, but then after he gained power, he turned their backs on them. So we can see these patterns of promise from the political parties to keep the settlements alive. And then when voted into power, they do the opposite. But then in the case of Old Fadama, in Ghana, the settlement is still there because of clientelism. No one wants to evict them because they know over 80,000, currently over 100,000 people live in Old Fadama. And then when you go and evict them, it means you are losing votes. So that is some positive of clientelism when it comes to the presence of this neighborhood in Ghana as it is today. Yeah.
I know that the time is running, and can I go ahead, Lena? Yeah. So I will not take much time, maybe in 1 minute. Are we seeing a political change of the debate using the internet? I think for this answer is a yes and no. At the same time that, yeah, internet has been probably one of the tools that people are using now to mobilize is very positive. But at the same time, there are some negative aspects of using internet, and not only in Mozambique, maybe everywhere. The spread of disinformation is also growing in Mozambique, and we saw this with elections. The second part is about polarization. We've been seeing people not discussing positively about politics, but probably discussing because you are not part of my team, and I don't like you because you are part of Frelimo and not because you are a citizen. So this kind of polarization is also one of the negative aspects of public debate. And the last point is about repression. Internet shutdown is also one way of different governments, including my government here in Mozambique, used in 2024 to shut down internet. So the same time that we can have positive aspects, we also have this negative way. And lastly, was on the question that I put when I ended my presentation. I think that internet can change the way that we still think politics, but because of my background on political science, I still think that the elections are important. Democracy is also important, and not only by doing the revolutions that we will change the world. So maybe it's because of my background, but I feel that election and democracy are still important when we discuss about politics, because all these movements, the unique way to change is doing politics formally, and the unique way of doing it for democracy is elections. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to the two of you for being so brief. And yeah, what a nice word to end this webinar. We should also not lose sight of formal politics. And maybe also one of the questions for further research is how can we bring youth to participate again more in formal politics? And how does politics have to change to be more attractive for young people? And I think that is equally true for Europe as it is for Africa. So thanks to you, and also thanks to the audience who enlightened us with their great questions. And I hand back to Lise or Alain for the wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you to all participants for your time, your interest, and your questions. Special thanks to Lena, Dercio, and Joel for this fascinating discussion. You can find out more about our work on urban governance in Africa on our Ifri website. So yeah, thank you all and have a good day. And I hope we see you all again for another great project like this one. Thank you.